Hi, my name is Ginger. I am the creator of Traveling Kindness Rocks, and I may have an opportunity in this video to share a little bit about that with you, but the intention of this video is to teach you all of the tips and the techniques in one video that I have picked up on my journeys of teaching thousands of people how to make dot mandalas. And this is going to be just about tips how to use dotting tools. So after I've taught so many folks, I have learned a number of tips that I can pass on, and I'm happy to do that. To do this tutorial video, I'm going to be using two sets of our tools so that you can see it works with different types of tools. This is our larger set. This is a set of 9 dotting tools that we have created. All of our tools are handmade, so the tips on these ones are metal. And then I'm also going to be using at times our set of 7 tools. So these are handmade as well, and the smallest make dotting tool in this set, as well as the one in our set of 9, are actually, the tip is the same. So I probably will just use and demonstrate with one of those. So we're going to change the camera angle, move it down here, and I'm going to just play around with making dots, no mandalas, just dot making, and give you every tip I can around making the best dots that are possible. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is start with a small dotting tool, one of the flat edges, and we'll work with the flat edges first, and then I'll show you some tips around using the Stylus's embossing tools, the metal that is shaped like a ball. So we'll start with the flat tips and a small dotting tool. So the first thing is with these tools, on the wooden ones, you can use either end, and I'll demonstrate with this one first and then the metal tip. So when you are working, no matter what type of tool you're using with the flat edges, you're going to hold your tool so it is perpendicular. So that's tip number 1. So it's not a pencil grip, it's not angled off to the side, it is perpendicular, and that is so that the flat edge will get an even coverage. We want to do that. Second tip, as you can see here, I'm going to angle this a little bit better for you. We're going to let the tool just touch the surface of the paint. It is not dipping all the way in. It is just making contact with the surface. So that's the second tip. And that's going to allow you to develop better control over the amount of paint that the tool is using. Now it helps if I move this so you can see the dots. There we go. So if you can control those two things, both using perpendicular and just touching the surface of the paint, what you'll start to do is build up consistency of the amount of paint that's going on the tool. And with consistency on the tool, you are getting consistent sized dots, which is what you want in your designs. Now I'm going to switch to one of our metal tip tools and just show you that it works the same way. So again, I'm just touching the surface of the paint and holding the tool perpendicular. And of course, the other thing that you're seeing me do is I'm getting more paint for every dot. Okay? So those are all important elements. Now let's switch to a tool that is still flat but is larger. The larger flat tools, we'll start with the wooden one, has a couple extra tips that I want to pass on to you. Because they engage so much paint, one thing is that you have to hold the surface down with your non-dominant hand. So I'm going to be doing that, but also my paint tray is positioned here to help. So you'll see that I am, again, holding the tool perpendicular. I'm just touching the surface of the paint. And with these bigger tools, especially adults will get a little bit nervous with how much paint is on there, and you'll see it's just holding on for dear life. So one tip with these bigger tools is let all that paint stay on there. Do not shake it off. I'm just going to go back and re-engage that paint there. So coming over to my work surface, one thing with the larger tools, the larger the tool, the more the paint. And what I'll encourage you to do is to actually go slower. And what's happening with these larger tools is that you can see the paint is just peeking out around the corner. And that means that I have allowed the paint to transfer and I'm ready to lift up. But what's key here is that the tool and the work surface do not make contact with each other. Okay? And the bigger the tool, I'll do one more of these guys, maybe a different color. The bigger the tool, the more paint, of course, you're putting down. And one thing that gets folks a little nervous at first is that they'll see a bubble of paint. You will see a bubble in here, and I'm going to hold up my paper. You can see it better on that Ocean Breeze color. And you will see that there is some extra paint. If I can angle this there, you can see it in here. And that's what we want. We want to have lots of paint in there. That shows me that you're doing a great job. And so we're going to now use our bigger tool in our metal tip set, and we'll do the same thing. You'll notice the technique is exactly the same. And I'm going to hold my surface down. Now if you've got a heavier surface, like if you're working on a rock, you won't have to hold the surface down. But what would happen if I don't hold my surface down is that the tool in the paint and all that's happening will actually have the paper, something light like a piece of paper, it will stick, and then when it disengages and gravity takes a hold of that paper and it falls back down, you're going to get a weird area of your dot. So you can see on the bigger tool in my metal tip set works the same way. I'm going to just do a demo I often do at the beginning of a class when I share with people how to use these big tools. So these are wonderful dots, and that takes time to practice. And generally when I use my smaller tools, as I get increasingly to a larger tool, I have to be even more gentle and use less pressure. So that's a general rule there. If I was to take, I'll work on this dot here, and to take my tool, and let's say I'm in the middle of making this dot, and I push all the way down, you can see that I get the paint kind of spread out. Sometimes you'll even see right through the dot, and the area where it is an edge of the dot is not as crisp. So play around with your bigger dots. I'm going to use another metal tip tool that's a little bit smaller. What I want you to always do is to play around with your dots, consistently being just so they are slightly bigger than the outer edge of your tool. If they are a little smaller, that means you need to put a little more pressure, just let a little more paint transfer there until those tools, the dots are the size of the bottom of the tool. Okay, so those are some tips around using your smaller flat tools up to your larger set of tools. Now we're going to work with one of the Stylus tools or embossing tools. So again, in our set of 7, this tool and the smaller making tool in our metal set, the tips are actually the same. So these are all handmade, and these tools are really fun. So with all the flat end tools, like I mentioned at first, you can hold them at perpendicular. That's where you want to hold them. Now with this tool, you can hold it like a pencil. You could hold it perpendicular as well. But one of my tips is going to be that you find the angle that works for you, and then you're holding your tool at that angle consistently. If you start holding your tool perpendicular, and then you adjust it and you change it to an angle like I am right now, what will happen is you will readjust the amount of paint, and it's going to make inconsistent dots. So when you do a technique like this, if you adjust in the middle of it, you can see these are going progressively smaller, and then I adjust and change my tool, I'm going to end up getting a dot that is a little out of place with that progressively smaller and smaller sets of dots. So you want to, I'll show you again, keep your paint and your tool on the same angle, whatever angle's feeling good, but don't adjust it in the middle of making one of those, I call them tapers, some people call them walk in the dots. So do not adjust or reposition it. Okay, now a couple other things with this tool and working with dots like this. When you're in the middle of the design work and you're doing this a number of times, you're going to notice that the paint builds up on the tool. So what will happen over time is that you'll see this dot here is starting a little bit larger than the one before. So be on the lookout for paint buildup on your tool. And as you go through making this technique in a certain stage in your design, just wipe off the paint and bring it down to the beginning of no paint at all. So you'll start to develop control over these finer details. And then there's one other thing to point out with these tools. And one is that if, depending on how far into the paint you dip, you can really get a big range of dots. So let's take a look. If I was to just take the very edge of this tool and touch it to the paint, you'll see I'm just basically only have about 20% of that tool touching the dots, and or touching the paint, and you'll see the size dots that is creating. Now, if I was to dip it and get that whole entire ball in there, am I going to get a larger dot? You see that? It is larger. Now, it may seem like, oh, well, that's not a big difference, but as you get creating more and more dot mandalas, something like that is important to know, because you can start to play around and control that fact that this one tool can do such a range of dots. You may even decide, like, you know what, I want some of these tiny dots. So you could have a practice sheet over here, get some of that extra paint off, and go, okay, now I'm ready to implement some small dots. You see, only those small dots would make it onto your piece. So you can really play around with that. I want to show you one more thing before I angle the camera up, and that is that you can grow a dot. You can make a dot get a bit larger. So I think for that I'll pick one of my medium-sized wooden dowels, or one of my tools from my wooden set. And what I'm going to do is show you that if I was making a set of dots in my design, and let's make a few here. And let's say this guy right here, is slightly smaller than the others in the set. When you're creating your design, you can go, oh, you know what, I'm going to grow that dot. So you can go back to your paint while that dot is wet, and you can go and double dot it, as I call, and make it grow a little bit larger. So you can go right over top of it and increase the size. You can grow a dot, but you cannot shrink a dot. One more thing to talk about when it comes to making dots well is the paint consistency. So we'll talk about that to finish off. The paints are a very critical element. If you are using a paint that is too thick, you're not going to get nice crisp shapes to your dots. If you use a paint that is too runny, you're making it too hard on yourself. Your fine motor skills are going to have to be even more fantastic. And what will happen is you will not have as much control over making sets of dots that are consistent in size, which is what you want. And I say, if we can make it easier, let's make it easier. So people ask me all the time what kind of paint I use. This is Craftsmart paint that I have been using, and it's a matte finish. But this is just one paint on the market that you can play around with. And it doesn't have to be an acrylic. You could play around with other types of paint and see what you come up with. So the paint coming out of the bottle or whatever container it comes in, you need it to be a great consistency. So try different brands that are available to you. And then the other thing is be aware that the consistency of the paint will actually change as it is sitting there in your tray or whatever you're using. So it may start out fantastic, but if you are in an area where your space is dry and the paints are drying out, you have to be aware that you're going to start to see that there's a slight film over top of the paint, and you need to stir it, or perhaps even abandon that little bit of paint and give yourself some new. So be on the lookout that the paint is staying as fantastic as when you started. And if your dots start to look not as great, and you know you've been practicing more, chances are something's up with your paint. The other thing to be aware of is that if you're using a tray like I have, these are cupped on the bottom, like it's scooped out. So when you take a larger tool, one of our larger tools, and you're going down in there, what will happen is if your paint's shallow, you're going to know, if you think about what's under there, you've got a little scoop here. So the paint has to be in those scooped out areas high enough that a tool this size is going to get completely covered. So if you let your paint get lower, lower, lower in your tray, and you're noticing that these larger tools, you were doing fantastic and now you're not, chances are you just need to give yourself more paint so you get complete coverage on these large tools. That's really important, complete coverage on those tools. So my name is Ginger. You can check out the website that I've put in place called travelingkindnessrocks.ca. Traveling is spelled with 2 L's. And you can explore all kinds of ways that I use dot mandalas to connect people all around the world. So the programs I've developed is just about that, using dot mandalas to help and give a platform for people to peacefully connect and support each other. There's many ways to get involved, and you may want to explore that, and I encourage you to give me a shout if you have any questions, and also to check out what a traveling kindness rock is. This is one right here, so you can check out what that is and why we're called that. So happy dotting, everybody. Thanks for following along on this tutorial, and I hope it helps you to make even more wonderful dots.